Bore da a croeso nôl. Good morning and welcome back to our second session of the day. I hope you enjoyed that first session with the Minister and with the Salvation Army, Housing First Cardiff representatives and our very own Alex Osmond. I'm really delighted to introduce our second session of the day, where I'm joined by the leading experts in Housing First from England and Scotland, from our sister organisations, Homeless Link and Homeless Network Scotland. We work really closely together, keeping in touch throughout the year, comparing notes on how Housing First is progressing across the different nations, and trying to offer support to each other as we try and support the expansion and maintain the fidelity of the model across the different nations of Great Britain. So I'm really pleased that they're here today. They're going to be sharing their views on how Housing First is progressing across Scotland and England, and sharing the kind of opportunities and the challenges and barriers that them and the people that they represent face when trying to deliver Housing First. So first up, I'm really delighted to introduce Claire Frew from Homeless Network Scotland, who's going to give us the perspective from Scotland. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you, Katie. It's really lovely. It's really lovely to be here. I was joking with Katie a few weeks ago about how I was really pleased to be at the very first Housing First Wales conference back at a time when we used to be able to travel places. And it was had a lovely journey to Cardiff. Had a lovely trip to Cardiff, but couldn't work out flights to get me there in good time. So I ended up on what became an almost 24-hour train journey to get from Glasgow to Cardiff and back. So as much as I'm looking forward to seeing you all in person again, it will hopefully be an easier journey than that. So for now, we'll settle for online, as it certainly is just a way to get to as many people as possible. So as Katie said, I work for Homeless Network Scotland, and I've been working on Housing First really since about 2009, 2010. So quite a while when I think about it. It's never until you start to have these conversations do you ever think about how long you've been working on something. So just in the next 5 to 10 minutes, I'm just going to share, I suppose, some a little bit of history, a little bit about where we think we're going, and just some observations, and the hope that it generates some questions from you as we go, because it's definitely an opportunity. Scotland is a small country, Wales is a small country, and there's so much that we can learn from each other because some of our contexts are quite similar. Obviously there are differences as well, but it's nice to have some friends and colleagues so nearby that we can learn so much from. So I suppose just by a way of a little bit of history, some of you may know some of this before, but apologies if you do. But Scotland's Housing First journey began officially in 2010 with the Turning Point Scotland delivery of the very first project in Glasgow, and following additional small-scale delivery in other parts of Scotland. Our focus as Homeless Network Scotland and a whole range of partners became about how do we achieve a national policy commitment to Housing First, to just make it what we do. And that felt quite different to us, rather than just having a series of relatively small projects, all of which would be delivering high quality housing first, but not necessarily related to each other in any way, and not developing necessarily in a national strategic way. So that kind of became our focus really, probably best part of a decade ago, and we just wanted to try and create the conditions for this national policy and political commitment. As I'm sure many of you know, it can take a while to reach that point in time. But from 2017, the national policy objective in Scotland did come into place, following recommendations from what we had, what we called the Homelessness and Rough Sleeping Action Group. I think you might have had something quite similar in Wales as well, bringing together the best minds that we have and bringing together people with real expertise in homelessness to say, right, what is it we need to do if we are genuinely committed to ending homelessness in Scotland. And one of their key recommendations was that Housing First become the default option for those who need it. And that was really what we were looking for, was just that. It was just that bit about it, as I said, just becoming what we do. And because that recommendation came through this group, and this group reported directly to the Scottish Government, that led quite quickly to quite a strong policy commitment. First of all, and in a range of ways, and I just wanted to note a few of them, just from that perspective, I say, because obviously Scotland's got its own devolved government, Wales has its own too, and at the very top level, I think where it sits quite interestingly in Scotland is that this housing first policy was included in the First Minister's programme for government. And that might not sound like very much, but it does make a difference when you have your First Minister, when we had Nicola Sturgeon standing up in Parliament, setting out her commitment to a whole range of things over the course of the year. And one, the fact that homelessness was included, but secondly, that it was housing first that she focused on within that. And that immediately gave it a level of prominence that, even though it was something the Scottish Government had been supporting for a little while, that the minute it becomes First Minister level, that certainly changes the focus a bit, which is great, because what it effectively means, for good or bad, is that progress on Housing First has to be reported directly to the First Minister. So yeah, that brings with it a bit of pressure, but it also brings with it a level of prominence. And a level of commitment that we certainly didn't have before. So certainly placing it in the First Minister's office is something that definitely feels significant. And alongside that, much as you will have in Wales, and I'm sure in England as well, when we hear from Alex, is that Housing First sits within what we have as our national Ending Homelessness Together action plan. Housing First sits firmly within that as part of our transition to rapid rehousing. Within the Scottish Government, we've also recently, or particularly more recently, and interestingly, and I think positively, we've got a lot of cross-departmental work on Housing First happening, which is great, because we all know, for everybody who's working in the Housing First world, we all know it's not just a housing response, and it's not just a response when people are homeless. And we have seen real progress, particularly with our Minister for Drugs Policy and our new Minister for Mental Wellbeing, who interestingly used to be, up until earlier this year, was our Housing Minister, who led a lot on Housing First. So we're seeing that pollination across government now, in the sense that the previous Housing Minister is already taking Housing First into his conversations in the mental health and mental wellbeing world as well, and placing it there to work out how they can work more closely together. But the work with the Minister for Drugs Policy as well has been really, really positive, and making really, really strong connections there. So we started with a lot of high-level commitment, and over the past couple of years, we're really seeing that become something more practical, which is great, and something much more cross-departmental, which is also great. These are the things that move it forward. These are the things that mean we will really make progress and really embed Housing First in what we do. And as I say, that's our ultimate aim, that it just becomes what we do. We almost don't even want to have to name it as a thing in future. It just becomes so normal to us. I think it was all of the other political parties, and it was so all the parties, as part of their manifestos for the Scottish Parliament election, endorsed Housing First. And again, that felt important to us, because it doesn't just mean Scottish Government commitment to something, it's actually shared across all political parties. And again, these are the things that just give this weight as we move forward. So that was just kind of by way of kind of setting out some of our political landscape. I won't bore you with all of the different policy papers that you can go and read that reference Housing First. If you really want to ask me about them in the chat, happy to share more. But just by way of saying just how deeply embedded Housing First is becoming and the work of government and actually the work of other political parties as well. So just in the final few minutes, and I hope that was just kind of some useful context. I know that the last time I was speaking to you and at other times, as we always know, when we have this policy commitment, the thing about a policy commitment is that it has to become a real world commitment. And how do we do that? And in Scotland, that was through our Pathfinder, our Housing First Pathfinder programme. Now, as I say, that was because we didn't want it to Housing First just to become, I say, a policy commitment on paper, and then we actually in the real world just kind of carried on as we normally had. It had to mean something, and it had to mean something important, and that became our Pathfinder programme. But how we started delivering it to scale on the ground. And that's been operational since 2018. And I just wanted to share with you a couple of headlines from that, just so you know where we're at. So it became operational in 2018. It covers Aberdeen City and Aberdeenshire, as well as Dundee, Edinburgh, Glasgow and Stirling. And we count every month the number of people moving into their new tenancies, and we are delighted to have passed the 500 tenancy milestone. We passed that earlier this year. We're creeping closer to the 550 milestone as well, which is really significant for us, because before the Pathfinder started, we had approximately 100 people across the whole of Scotland in Housing First tenancies, and in the short period since 2018, that's an additional over 500 people. So in terms of scaling up, that really has been significant. We're still measuring tenancy sustainment at 85%, which is again responds really well, measures really well against international evidence. We're delighted there has been absolutely no evictions at all, and that's not just because evictions were paused during the pandemic, because there were still mechanisms that could be used if there were real challenges, and we've never needed to. None of the landlords involved have ever needed to use this. So 2.5 years in. To say that there have been absolutely no evictions at all is one of the things we're really, really proud of. But on the flip side of that, what I would say is when you begin these things, you're not sure what it is that's going to happen. And actually, the biggest reason for ended tenancies, why we're down at 85%, the biggest reason has actually been the tenant passing away. Really sadly, that's been their main reason, many of which are drugs related, which is why when I mentioned before about the strong linkages with the minister responsible for drugs policy in Scotland, that's why we really want to make sure we've got that there, because we are seeing the impact on that. And I know that's a particular challenge in Scotland. I know it's a challenge everywhere, but it really is. Drug deaths is a particular challenge in Scotland, and we are very much seeing that as part of the Pathfinder. So that's just some headlines of just some of the real world stuff that we're seeing and some of what we've kind of where we're at. And just finally, just a couple of quick final points. Our Pathfinder comes to an end in March 2022, and we're in this really important and sensitive stage, actually, of mainstreaming both the delivery and the funding. It's always the challenge when you create a Pathfinder of some kind with its own separate funding stream and its own separate delivery stream. The challenge is now to mainstream that back into local delivery. And to support that, and to support all parts of Scotland moving towards Housing First, we were really pleased in partnership with the Scottish Government to publish Scotland's first national framework for Housing First. So we really see this now. We've come a long way, but we now see this as an extended 10-year programme to really get us where we need to be. And I say we've come a long way. We've had 5 times as many people moving into Housing First tenancies than over the past few years than before. We're still reporting high tenancy sustainment. We've got political support. We've got cross-government prioritisation. And yeah, our challenge is to make sure the next 10 years are as successful as the past 4 or 5 have been. So I'll leave it there and happy to answer any questions later. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Claire. That was a really comprehensive overview of the situation in Scotland, and I'm sure there'll be loads of questions coming in for you. I'd like to introduce Alex Smith next from Homeless Link, who leads on Housing First in England. Reminder, please get your questions in the Q&A section of the chat, ready for the session later on, where we'll be able to put those questions to both Claire and Alex. Alex, welcome, really pleased to have you here. If you could give us the overview of the situation in England, that would be absolutely fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. Barada. Thank you so much for the invite. Great to be part of the conference. Yeah, I'm Alex. I am Senior Project Manager at Homeless Link. So we're a membership charity that represents the homelessness sector in England, and I lead on our Housing First England project. So we're a project that combines practice, policy and research with the ultimate aim of seeing Housing First scaled up in a sustainable way and a high fidelity delivery across England, to make sure that everybody that needs that kind of intervention is able to access it. Some research that was done back in 2018 estimated that at any one time there are 16,500 people that require Housing First. So our ultimate aim and the reason that we exist is to try and get England to that point. We do that in lots of ways. A lot of resources are published to support commissioners and providers, social landlords, local authorities to understand Housing First, and to understand about how to implement, develop and deliver. All of that information is available on the Housing First England website. So if anyone is interested, please head over there and have a look. Back in 2016, we developed the principles for Housing First in England, and they're largely used now as the kind of footprint for the development of Housing First, which is great, and we've seen some really great interaction from the Housing First community on that work, and there's a real sense of a movement developing in England. Some of the research that we conduct, so in 2017 we completed the Picture of Housing First research that was then repeated again in 2020, just at the end of last year, and we will be doing that a third time in 2023. So we'll have 6 years worth of data to see exactly what the scale up looks like across England. So I thought it would be useful maybe just to share some of the highlights from that latest report and comparing to 2017. So the first thing to mention is just the number of services. So we've increased from 32 services to over 100. It was 105 by the end of last year. I think it's probably gone up a little bit more since then. But yeah, over 100 services, and we are now supporting at any one time around 2,000 people in England, which is about a 6-fold increase to where we were at in 2017. So we're definitely heading in the right direction, which is good news. On average, we've got 4 Housing First support workers in our services. So there's still fairly small scale services that we have in England. And I'll say a little bit more about that as I go through. The other couple of points that I think are interesting, again, all of this is on the Housing First England website for anyone that wants more detail, but we've seen actually an increase in the use of social housing in England, and that's at 81%, which is great. We've seen a slight decrease in the use of private rented accommodation. And in terms of funding, which I think is something that I really want to talk about a bit more, almost 50% of the funding for Housing First in England is through the Rough Sleeper Initiative funding. And there are some real issues with that in terms of the short-termism of that. A lot of them are 12-month funding cycles, which I think, as was mentioned in the opening session, poses real challenges for Housing First and fidelity to the principles of providing support for as long as it's needed, and puts an awful lot of pressure on providers about how to make that a reality and to protect staff and to protect residents as well from the uncertainty that often exists. So overall in England, I think the picture is quite positive. We're certainly, as I say, moving in the right direction. But unlike Scotland and to an extent Wales, we do have a very local approach to Housing First. It's really developed at quite a local level, which means there is a bit of a postcode lottery. And in that picture of Housing First research, we see that there's a real difference in different regions in England about what the coverage and availability of Housing First, what that looks like. So that is a real challenge for us, and I think something that really needs to be addressed to make sure that we are getting to that point that everybody that needs Housing First is able to access it. I think having a local development has its benefits as well, because it is really held in local communities. So what we see in England is, as I said before, a real sense of movement around Housing First, a real commitment to the principles. It's not something that's been kind of asked of them. It's really developed out of need in the local area, and people are really largely very bought in to the model and really want to make it work. Outside of the kind of the 100 and odd services that, you know, are relatively small scale and developed locally, in 2018, as part of the government's manifesto commitment, we saw investment of £28 million in 3 regional Housing First pilots. So this is England's first attempt really at Housing First at scale, where we're working across multiple local authority areas in 3 regions and supporting a very large number of people in Housing First. So those pilots are across Greater Manchester, across Liverpool Combined Authority and West Midlands Combined Authority. And at the end of that pilot, there is a hope that over 1,000 people will be supported. And there's really quite a lot kind of riding on the learning from those 3 pilots to see what scale looks like for us in England and how that can be both sustained, which is really a very crucial point, and then also scaled up to other regions as well. So far, things are really positive with the pilots. There is an interim evaluation that's been published. We see, as Claire said, you know, in line with other international evidence, around an 88% tenancy sustainment rate, and really some brilliant learning coming out. But one of the key learnings, and something that we at Housing First England are really focused on, is that it was a 3-year funding cycle. And those pilots are due to come to an end next year. And at the minute, there is a lot of uncertainty around what will happen beyond the 3 years. So we've potentially got up to over 1,000 people being supported in Housing First. And a lot of our work at the minute now is trying to avoid that cliff edge that might come next year, because the situation that we've got is that there is a little bit of a gap between when those pilots are due to come to an end and when the final evaluation of the pilots will be published. And the ministry, communities and local government want to see the findings of that final evaluation, understandably, before committing to something larger scale. But that won't be published until after the end of the funding. So there's real pressure at the moment around trying to secure that bridge funding to cover that interim period, to make sure that people have got security in their jobs and that the support can continue to be provided to the people that are in Housing First. So yeah, it's quite an exciting time. I think that there is huge potential around the pilots and what it can show us about what's possible and what the future could look like, but also quite a nervous time as well for the providers and for us about what next year will bring. So yeah, I guess that's a kind of watch this space and see how that develops. The last thing I wanted to mention, so at the beginning of this year, the Centre for Social Justice published the Close to Home report, which was looking at a national programme for Housing First in England. And this is really a bit of a blueprint for us about what the future might look like. And I was just going to mention the kind of 3 key recommendations from that report, which resonate with, I think, things that have already been said previously by other speakers. And the first is around the sustainability of funding, and actually that including multi-agency commissioning. Great to hear Claire talking about the investment and interest from other government departments around Housing First. I think that really should be the future, that we move away from seeing Housing First as solely as a housing intervention or a solution to homelessness. It is absolutely as much of a health and social care intervention as anything else. And I think we need to get our health and social care colleagues on board with that here in England. There is also an ask for increase of supply of social housing, including a priority in allocations and lettings around Housing First. And the third recommendation is providing national stewardship. So looking at a national programme, a high fidelity implementation plan, standardised national framework, and a phased rollout for England. So yeah, our work is really going to be using that report and trying to influence the coming spending review, and really try to get that commitment, which is estimated at 150.3 million for a further 3 years to roll out to the scale that we need in England. So quite a big task ahead, a busy few years, I think, for Housing First in England, but hopefully that's given a good overview. I'll leave it there, Katie.
Thank you very much, Alex. Really fascinating to hear from the different situations in Scotland and in England. And I can see that we've got a few questions coming in on the Q&A. One of the questions I had was, and both of you kind of touched on this in slightly different ways, of how important has the political leadership been in order to get the delivery of Housing First in particular areas? And I guess, Claire, you know, your perspective from the Scottish Government's leadership, Alex, probably a little bit different. I'm getting a sense that there has not been as robust leadership from the UK government. However, regionally, maybe the mayors and that sort of thing, whether there's been kind of leadership locally which has helped to kind of further development of Housing First. Claire, do you want to go first?
Sure, thanks, Katie. It is an excellent question. I think what I would say, I think where we started, I think it very much started in the sector without, Housing First started in the sector without a lot of political commitment. But I think what we were able to do was convince the Scottish Government, which to be absolutely fair to them was not particularly hard to do. They were very open-minded about it and looking for solutions. I think what that commitment has done, I say we are a small country, so sitting at Scottish Government level is really what has allowed us to just move faster and do more. And the Scottish Government has been able to bring in we've got 32 local authorities in Scotland, and this is now a conversation in all of them. And that's only, we could not have done that if the Scottish Government hadn't taken the role they have. We wouldn't be there without the First Minister saying what she has and that kind of ministerial commitment. So it certainly sped us up. It's put a lot of eyes on what we're doing, which again has both has some good points to it, but also they can be a little bit scary at times. But yeah, it's been essential for us to have it not feel quite so piecemeal as I think it otherwise would.
Yeah, and I think that's reflected here in Wales. There's certainly kind of very robust leadership from the minister that we have. But I think, you know, that getting that buy-in and that commitment to the culture of Housing First locally is equally as important as national leadership, because, you know, you can get diktats from national government as much as you like, but if people on the ground don't believe in it, then you're probably going to struggle. And Alex, do you have some reflections on maybe either, you know, local authorities leadership or local communities and some of the regional stuff with the mayors?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the picture is quite different in England. You know, I envy the manageable number of local authorities that you both have, over 340 here in England. So it's difficult to keep track and to have that level of kind of consistency around things. That is one of our challenges. I think locally, where we have Housing First, largely the buy-in is just brilliant. There is such a commitment, and I think you can see that across the 3 regional pilot areas, the 3 combined authority, the mayors. Andy Burnham is a huge advocate and is always kind of championing. And I think I can see the comment in the chat box about, it seems strange when the pilots are so successful that there would even be a question over funding. And I think that is one of our challenges, is trying to translate that local political commitment to Westminster and ensuring that the leaders in central government are kind of getting those messages and understanding. I think as the Minister said this morning, with Housing First, I think there's always the kind of hearts and minds argument, and then there's the baseline kind of financial arguments, and trying to kind of find a balance between the two, ensuring that it works and it is value for money. I think that there is commitment, through the all-party parliamentary group for Housing First. They're going to be launching their report next Tuesday, which, strong support for Housing First. So, I think we are moving in the right direction. I think there are some slightly concerning kind of narratives around Housing First style, or in the spirit of Housing First, that sometimes comes out, which again, as the Minister this morning was talking about, how important it is not to dilute the model, and I think that's one of our big concerns, is that there's maybe a bit of fidelity fatigue, and we're thinking about ways of trying to kind of avoid that, and making sure that we can stick to a high fidelity rollout in future.
Yeah, definitely agree. And we've heard a few of those, Housing First or in the spirit of Housing First. And, I think there should probably be a law that you can't use the term Housing First unless it is, in line with the principles. There's no Housing First light. It's either Housing First or not. And, it's important to reiterate that there's lots of other housing-led models that do the job. That housing, everything doesn't need to be Housing First. Housing First is for a kind of specific, client group that it's targeted at. And, it's nothing wrong with doing another type of housing-led intervention. But that fidelity is really, really important, because to achieve the kind of success rates that you both have outlined, that's because we're maintaining the fidelity of the model. And if we weaken that, then, the tenancy success rates will go right down, and we'll be back in a situation where we have been. Moving to some questions from the audience. A question about is there better availability of private housing in Scotland? And Alex, feel free to chip in from England, although I assume that differs from area to area. A reflection that it's really hard to access private lets for people on benefits here, and a shortage of social housing means that private lets are the only real way right now to increase the availability of housing stock. So any reflections on accessing the private rented sector from you both? And if I go to Claire first, thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Katie. Another really important question. I think I always have to start this by saying that we're obviously lucky in Scotland in that we don't necessarily always have a shortage of social housing, which gives us a platform to grow this from. So that's certainly an advantage, that sometimes when we've got our heads in what's happening in Scotland, we can forget sometimes that is the case. What it's meant for us in terms of the private rented sector is that we've only had to use it sparingly. It's there as an option. It tends not to be the option that most people want when you have the conversation about their housing aspirations and where they want to live. I think we're still, of the over 500 tenancies, I think we're still in single figures for the numbers who've actually accessed a private rented tenancy. And for those who have, it's often been about location. So, for example, Edinburgh is one of our areas. Edinburgh's housing market is quite distinct in Scotland in terms of the pressure on it. But even there, we've not had to use it that much because of the amount of social housing we have, and just been able to place this within their allocations structures. So, but it remains a question for us, because we genuinely do see it as a positive option for those that want it. but it's and for the landlords that have participated, they've been really keen to participate, and they're seeing tenancy sustainment from it. So, but it still feels quite small for us. I think that makes our context maybe a little bit different compared to some others.
And I guess that tenancy sustainment examples of where it has worked is a really strong argument for private landlords that, you know, with the intensity of support that you get around Housing First, the likelihood of sustaining that tenancy is much higher than for people without support. Alex, any reflections from you on accessing the private rented sector in England?
Yeah, I mean, it is really varied. I think, you know, the housing market just looks, you know, completely different. In, you know, where I am in Newcastle, it's very different to how it is down in the southeast and the southwest. So, yeah, I think it's variable, and we see, I think, in Housing First, that kind of combination, a bit like Claire said, it's not the most popular option, but sometimes it does afford the flexibility that's needed, and increases that choice and control element. So it does work for some people. Obviously, I think from the long-term perspective, maybe the concerns are that it doesn't give the kind of security of tenure in England. Yeah, we're going to be seeing some changes to issue short-hold tenancies, but I think maybe people are less keen on that in terms of the worry that someone is going to maybe see an eviction and have to move again. We've seen in England the development of some kind of landlord liaison roles within Housing First. So got kind of specific roles within the Housing First teams that are there to kind of go out and procure and build relationships with private landlords, to do all of the, you know, explaining what Housing First is, what the intensive support means, what the kind of reassurances are around some of the concerns that private landlords might have. So that seems to, you know, where there are pressures in social housing markets, that seems to work quite well. And then there's an interesting development in Greater Manchester as part of the pilot around the ethical lettings agency, as another way of trying to access good quality private rented sector for Housing First.
Great, thanks very much both. That's really helpful. A couple of questions have come in on the same sort of theme, really, for both of you. We've heard about the tenancy sustainment, the really positive tenancy sustainment rate. So would you be able to share a bit more information on the preventative work that is in place that has helped to prevent those evictions from happening where people have hit hurdles or hit challenges in their lives? And what do you think is the secret to success in tenancy sustainment? I don't know who wants to go first on this.
I'm happy to give it a go if that's all right. I think that, I mean, we're really pleased with the tenancy sustainment rate that we're achieving at the moment. And as I mentioned before, we are seeing a large number of tenant deaths, which it's just incredibly sad at a number of levels, and particularly in relation to drug-related deaths. So if we take those out of our calculations, our tenancy sustainment rate would be, I think, about 92 or 93%. So I think that there's a couple of things that I would say. We've mentioned before fidelity to the principles as much as possible. It's not easy. It can vary not just from area to area, but from person to person, and what choice and control might mean to one person is different from what it might mean to others. But a real concerted effort to build them into everything that you do. I think in terms of preempting problems, I think what we've also seen is, you know, really strong relationships between the landlord and the support provider. So having ongoing conversations, even when there is not a lot to say, just to maybe just say, look, we're going to check in. You know, we've seen examples of people saying, look, the support provider saying, look, we're just going to check in once a week. Even if there's nothing to report, but just to keep that line of communication open, allow the landlord to say, actually, we're getting a little bit concerned, you know, speak to the staff. And one of the examples that I always really liked actually was really proactive support staff going and meeting the whole, with a housing association, and meeting the whole team. And this was including staff who worked in like kind of high-rise blocks of flats and the kind of concierge. And there was a situation where it was actually the concierge that spotted that something wasn't right. Basically, they spotted somebody who every time he left the building always said hello, always stopped for a quick chat. You know, just that thing that you do. And then for a couple of days, he didn't. he just didn't acknowledge the person that he's spoken to every morning. So the concierge had a little bit of Housing First training, not training to do it, but just to understand a little bit about what it was. Picked up the phoned the support staff just to say, I'm not quite sure. I think there might be something wrong here. They checked it out, and he needed, some particular support with his mental health, relook at his medications and all that kind of stuff. So it's those things that might sound really simple, but that was people being really proactive and saying, not just your housing officers and your allocations officers and your housing managers, speak to everyone, because who's going to be in contact with people and who might spot when things are maybe taking a bit of a turn for the worse. So I think all of those kind of things really help.
Thanks, Claire. Alex?
Yeah, that's such a great example, Claire. I love that. I would just kind of echo what you've said, really. I think there's something about the principles of Housing First. I think you can take elements, and some people do. It's not to say that other services aren't strengths-based or have a harm reduction approach, but I think there is something about the unique combination of all seven for us in England, but the combination of the principles that you use being implemented at the same time, and that the team really kind of buy into that and have a really open approach to reflecting about how they're doing with the principles and how they can maybe tweak what they're doing. So it to me, I think there's something about that buy-in. And one of the most important things, I think, is that a slight kind of shift, I guess, in mindset of thinking that it is the offer of accommodation that's permanent rather than the actual tenancy that someone might move into in the first instance. So if you come at it with that mentality and you accept that this is a group of people that have been out of living indoors for a very long time, it is going to take time for things to settle. There might be lessons to be learned about the kind of housing that works and the kind of neighbours that people need and all of the stuff that we know. If there's flexibility around that and there's a kind of willingness to say, okay, well, this isn't working, but we're going to work together to avoid getting to an eviction point and doing much more of the kind of planning around the transition and how we can get someone moved somewhere more appropriate, then we're maintaining the kind of tenancy sustainment rate there, but we're also accepting that people have different journeys and things might happen and we learn different things as we go forward. But we need, as Claire said, that kind of commitment from everybody to be able to make that happen. So I think bringing landlords on board with that kind of approach and that shift in thinking, and it can be quite a shift for some landlords, that have got a very punitive kind of approach to, difficult behaviours or antisocial behaviour or, problematic visitors and all the stuff that kind of goes on. I think we need to do a lot of that kind of building awareness with social landlord teams. We did quite a lot of work on this at the start of the year, thinking about resources specifically for housing management teams that are involved in Housing First and getting them on board and making sure that there is a real joint approach to how we're managing some of those challenges that might come up. For me, I think, it seems really important. And then the other thing I was just going to mention, I think, because it came up in a comment this morning as well, which I was really pleased to see, is just the quality of staff in Housing First. I don't think we can kind of emphasize enough really just how amazing how Housing First teams are. The level of skills and the value base and the reflective approach. I feel like Housing First is quite special, and I think the people that work in Housing First are quite special. And that the recruitment processes that Kath was talking about in kind of her learning from the accreditation, all of that just seems so important to the successful delivery, getting the right people. And that can be a real challenge, I think, trying to get those processes right and make sure you get the right people in place to see that the support is delivered in the right way.
Definitely. Thanks, Alex. I think you're so right, that point about, it's not a failure of a tenancy if someone decides that particular place is not right for them. We all through our lives decide, our needs have changed, our ambitions have changed, we want to move to a different area, and that's never seen as a failure. So it's really important to put it in those terms of, you've got this kind of settled accommodation status, and if you need to move, properties to meet your changing needs, and that's absolutely right. I'll have one final question. I think I saw it pop up on the chat. So it was about working with mental health services, and I know we've got a session later on today, and I think it's fair to say there are challenges in, you know, particularly mental health and substance misuse services are really important and critical to the successful delivery of Housing First. I know here in Wales there are challenges accessing mental health services quickly for people. So just a quick reflection on your experience of that and anything that has worked in your nations. And Claire, a kind of final one for you on, you've talked about drug policy and justice, and I think if that policy area wasn't devolved in Scotland, do you think you would have that work would have been possible in the framework that, you know, Alex and ourselves here in England and Wales have to operate under, and how important was that devolution of that policy area to support the delivery of Housing First? So Alex, if we could go to you first on the mental health question and then hand over to Claire.
Yeah, I mean, I think any conversation that you have around kind of partnerships or community integration, you inevitably come up against the challenge of access to mental health. I've thought about this a lot recently, and there's something about how do we do the systems change work that's needed to make Housing First really effective, which seems, you know, massive, because the challenges of accessing mental health services aren't unique to Housing First. They're across the board. Everybody is struggling. I would struggle to get an appointment with the mental health team, let alone someone that's got complex needs and, you know, a history of complex trauma. So I think we're talking about really big policy change that's needed. And I think some of that multi-agency commissioning might support some of that. But what we're seeing in England is a bit of a lean toward buying in that specialism to the Housing First team. So again, thinking of Manchester, who have got their dual diagnosis workers, we've got a Housing First grants programme, and we fund a trauma counsellor to sit within the Housing First team. And I wonder if it's the right thing to do, and I don't have an answer. Is it right to create kind of mini systems that bypass the big broken system that we don't know how to fix? Or do we need to do more of that systems change work, and how do we do that in an effective way? So yeah, I think I just agree that it's, you know, it's an endlessly complicated kind of situation, but so important. I think we're really limited as to what we can achieve without the support of mental health for people. So yeah.
I agree, and I think there's probably something about doing the kind of buying in and having those specialists within the teams whilst we try and fix the bigger system as the longer term ambition of it being accessible to people using Housing First. Claire, reflections from you on the mental health question and on the kind of devolution of drugs policy and how that's helped in Scotland. Not a small topic.
No, not a small topic at all. On the mental health stuff, I won't say too much in the sense that I don't think I've got that much to add from what Alex was saying. All the challenges you're describing, we face them too. There is that particular challenge of accessing the wider mental health system. Again, we've tried similar things, like, you know, maybe seconding some staff in, some specialist staff into some teams. Some have done it that way. Others have looked at setting up, you know, referral arrangements to say kind of prioritise people coming through the Housing First route. But either way, whichever way we do things, it very much remains a challenge. I think it's the long-term systems changing and the long-term commissioning. Those we've seen who have had their health and social care partnerships, for example, built in from the early stages and bought in, not just as in supporting it, as in it's a good thing, but actively involved in it. Then it does feel a little bit easier. On the second point about the bigger things that's evolved. So yes, in Scotland, not all drugs policy, but a lot of drugs policy is devolved, and criminal justice policy is also devolved. And those two for us they're really central to what it is we're trying to do. So it meant, for example, that our Minister for Drugs Policy was able to just very recently set up a new fund to allow people who wanted to access residential rehab to get round housing benefit requirements, to create a fund to allow someone's rent to still be paid, because we were seeing this as a challenge in Housing First. People who hadn't gone into rehab before, didn't feel ready, didn't want it, it wasn't the right time. They've been in their housing first tenancy for a few months, things are starting to go well, now starts to feel like the time, and then we face people with the impossible choice of, do you want to go to rehab now, or do you want to keep your tenancy? And it's a ridiculous place. It's a ridiculous thing to ask of people. And because of what's devolved to Scotland, our minister was able to create a fund to say, we don't want people to face that choice. And we can join these things. We can join these things up and avoid that as much as we possibly can to allow that to happen. So there's a lot of these things that we just would not have been able to do, and some of them are, and sometimes actually the things that we're putting in place can be relatively small, but that's fine. Sometimes it only needs to be small, but it's the fact that we can do it, and we can move forward with it. So I think particularly round about some of those things, and on the criminal justice things as well, Housing First very much dovetails with the direction of travel. For the Scottish Government in terms of justice policy, they've been working for years to try and avoid short-term sentences. We've got a presumption against short-term sentences, anything under a year. We had a case, just a very recent case, where I think a judge was making a decision about a short-term sentence. That was kind of what the Scottish Government were asking them to do. They found out the person had been engaging really well with their Housing First support, asked for a letter of support from the team, and said, if we get something positive and you continue to engage, then we'll avoid a custodial sentence for you. So because these things are devolved, it just means that either on a person by person basis or on that bigger Scottish Government level, we can just do a bit more and do a bit better, I think. So for us, it's really important.
Thanks, Claire. That's some really interesting insight. And, too often we hear in Wales the elements that aren't devolved, really ministers really struggling to kind of see through some of their policy intentions because of that. So, yeah, I'm sure that adds to the kind of call for devolution of justice in Wales. I'm aware that we've run over, but the kind of questions and the answers and the conversation was just so fantastic. And I knew that the audience would be finding it incredibly valuable. I guess we could talk for hours, but I'd like to say a big thank you to Alex and Claire for coming along and sharing your perspectives from Scotland and from England. It's been incredibly valuable. Hopefully we can bring you back every year and have an update on what's going on in the various nations. But a big thank you from me and from the team for giving up your time today. It's been a real pleasure. We're going to go for a break. We're due back at 12:15 for the next session, which will be going even further afield. We'll be hearing about Housing First implementation and fidelity across Europe. I'm really excited to be hearing from the Housing First Europe Hub about that. So please do join us after the break. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much both, and see the rest of you soon.
Thank you.